the research can happen at a variety of levels, and the tool itself is sufficiently general that it can allow for a user or an institution to approach the challenge and the theme in which it's introduced in a variety of ways. So you could be thinking about research in terms of content. So it can become a way to interpret specific content. So you could take the example of, say, for the Ubuntu Museum, where you start to think about interpretational artifacts. So instead of always having this kind of two separate entities where there's the artifact and then there's the kind of objective interpretation, which is normally quite dry. Sometimes it might be a documentary or something, short documentary, something like that. How can you bring these two things together and become creative in the interpretation of an artifact, so that the actual interpretation becomes an artifact in its own right? And I think that can be interesting for museums to explore. So you could engage students in research processes around artifacts and the collection, and then they could use the information generated through that research process to develop their mats, but then the mat development process becomes an own research process as well, in terms of that you have to think through all the key factors that are part of developing a mat, which is an interaction plan. So you're going to have to research that and test that and develop that. You're going to have to think through researching your visuals, gathering all your information together, developing your narrative. So that becomes another research project in its own right. So there's potential through this idea of an interpretational artifact of both building rich learning research processes for young people with the kit, but also providing for museum visitors exciting new ways to engage with the artifact that's on exhibit. So, and I think that what is also potentially interesting about something like that is that it can allow for an inclusive approach to interpretation. So how does the museum open up its doors and allow people beyond its immediate staff to think and research and interpret its collection? And I think that's a challenge that a lot of museums are looking at and thinking about, is inclusive development approaches to exhibitions, so that how a young person chooses to interpret an artifact will probably be quite different to how a museum professional schooled in museology would think about it. And perhaps that can be a way to make artifacts more accessible and more interesting for younger publics, and thereby make museums more attractive and more open. So a tool like this can be a tool that museums could use to make their collections more accessible through opening up their interpretation strategies. For me, it's still very much about entering into this first phase of allowing the kit to be used and begin to start evaluating what are the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities of the kit, and start to begin to hone down a research project that can go with it. I think that I'm particularly interested in looking at interaction design and how non-specialists respond to interaction design. So what happens when you give people who haven't necessarily gone through an interaction design course the tools to develop their own interactive narratives, and what are interactive narratives that come spontaneous, maybe not spontaneously, but that are perhaps more intuitive to people when looking at the tools and the potential to develop their own environments. So looking at that aspect will be key, looking at what kinds of narratives come out of that. So not just the interaction paradigm, so what kind of interaction is do people design themselves when they have the opportunity to design it, but also what kinds of narratives do people design, and what kinds of knowledge is built through this constructionist learning approach when applied to narrative development. And particularly in the collaborative sphere, I think that's a key focus, is to look at what kinds of how to design tools to facilitate co-present constructionist learning, collaborative constructionist learning. So how to design tools to support that type of learning, I think would be a key question for me, and what kinds of design decisions need to be taken to support that, and then also from a thematic approach in terms of what kinds of workshop themes and what kinds of contexts do you introduce the kid in to become more supportive in terms of learning, in terms of supporting people to develop their own artifacts and build knowledge better through that development process. So yes, what kinds of learning contexts is it suited to? How can it adapt learning environments and or augment them? I think will all be key.